the likes of Google, Facebook, Amazon, of course, who are sucking revenues directly out of the market in New Zealand. So he basically threw New Zealand First support behind the proposal to disestablish TVNZ and RNZ and create a new public broadcaster, but also that if Chris Farfoy brings a proposal to Cabinet to back the proposed NZME Stuff merger, or NZME buying stuff from the Australian owner, they would back that too for the same reasons. Now, the reason he said he would back this proposal, the latest bid from those media companies, is that part of the deal that's different from the first one is that Stuff's editorial operations would be ring-fenced, and there would also be a commitment to, for example, maintain a number of journalist jobs in the region. So the protection of the New Zealand aspect of that has basically tipped the case for New Zealand First.
Let's stay with the private sector proposal for a moment, because what had happened was the Commerce Commission had said no to a merger between Stuff and RNZ, the two big private media companies, both with what used to be called newspapers, or still are newspapers, and online, and also radio stations in the case of NZME. The Commerce Commission has said no. And so what's happened lately is that talks have gone on again between the companies, and now have they gone to Parliament essentially lobbying for another go with some kind of, they've dubbed it Kiwi share, haven't they, some kind of protection built in?
That's right. So Mr. Peters was pretty open. He said that the NZME or the interested players in this had approached him directly to lobby. He didn't say what the nature of those conversations were, except to suggest that it might not have been the best idea to approach him directly, whatever that means, but they seem to have got his support regardless. So basically, this is with ministers, although it would still have to go to the Commerce Commission. Now, the Commerce Commission rejected the original one because they were worried about the lack of competition, the lack of plurality of voices in the media industry. But again, this proposal would basically see you would still see two editorial separate operations. So news consumers would still be getting news from two competing outlets. Now, we don't know what the name of it would be or that sort of thing, but that is the essential principle. And as I said, along with that protection of New Zealand jobs, that has made the difference this time. And of course, too, this goes to the government first. The other one went to the Commerce Commission. It was out of ministers' hands.
So what's its status? Because I thought the initial noise coming out of the beehive when we started hearing that Stuff and NZME were having another go was rather lukewarm, perhaps from Labour ministers, because this would be an uncomfortable override or work around what the Commerce Commission had done. Are you saying it's now in a bit more of a formal process and would ultimately still go back to the Commerce Commission?
It would still have. My understanding is if the proposal went through Cabinet, for example, and government supported it, it would still have to go to the Commerce Commission. But I do not know the position of Chris Farfoy on this. There has certainly been a lot of talk about the various positions, but I think Winston Peters alluded to it in terms of that Commerce Commission and the intersection of ministers and the Commerce Commission. He said that they were initially, his party, New Zealand First, initially were concerned about the merger or the proposal because it could be seen as a workaround of the original Commerce Commission decision. But they've obviously been satisfied that this one does not, otherwise he would not have supported it.
Well, it goes back for a fresh consideration. So it respects the due process to some extent. Can I ask you now specifically about where this proposal to disestablish RNZ and disestablish TVNZ and create a new public broadcaster is? I heard you say this morning we're down to just one proposal, and it is the full. It's hard not to call it a merger in some ways, isn't it? Because
it's effectively a merger.
It's effectively a merger.
It is. It is.
You're going to need the expertise of at least some people within each of these entities to set up a new broadcaster. As you understand it, is it going to Cabinet on Monday? And if so, in what form?
Well, with Mr Peters' confirmation today that New Zealand First supports it, I think it probably will go to Cabinet because although there's a legislative process past that will require the majority of Parliament. To get it through Cabinet, they just need New Zealand First at this point. And of course, Winston Peters has given the go-ahead. Chris Farfoy absolutely wants this at least through Cabinet by the end of the year. So I think this would have been the obstacle in the way of going to Cabinet on Monday. So I expect it will go now.
Yeah, and what's happened today has also firmed up the likelihood of this going through and being confirmed, right?
Yes.
Why did he feel the need to make the speech? I'm wondering, because originally the minister had said, Chris Farfoy, the Labour broadcasting minister, had said he expected to make announcements on this before Christmas. Well, we're down to the last cabinet, we're down to the last hurrah. Had it been in flux somewhat? Has there been doubts either within New Zealand First or elsewhere within the coalition that had left it looking tentative? Why did he feel the need to come out and do this morning?
I think there are a couple of different elements. One was actually to establish New Zealand First's support for public broadcasting and actually the broader media in the past. Of course, New Zealand First and more specifically Mr Peters has a very combative relationship with the media. So you sort of have to separate the politics out from the policy and cabinet decisions and all of that sort of thing. And it got a little bit mixed up there with sometimes Winston Peters referring to the journalistic practices in New Zealand, but then we got back to talking about the policy. So I think that was part of it, to say, look, we as a party have long supported a strengthened public media and make that clear. I also think too there's been a bit of talk about New Zealand First potentially blocking it, or that, Labour were having difficulties, and I think he doing this makes it very clear that it's not New Zealand First who's blocking anything. In fact, it probably goes back then to the broader cabinet. So a few different messages coming out from the Deputy Prime Minister there today.
What would be the process? We're going to be talking to you possibly later in the morning about Ports of Auckland, because it's one thing to make decisions in principle, it's quite another thing to then go through all the processes that see that finally happen and when and how, if at all. And with the broadcasting situation, are there still serious questions within Cabinet and or beyond about the feasibility of this financially, or the feasibility of it when it comes to being the outcome that everyone seems to be seeking? Mr Peters this morning is making a speech about, which is trying to bolster the ability of the media and of journalism and New Zealand content. So are there still doubts elsewhere that you are detecting?
Yes, I think there are still major concerns about the implementation of this, and I outlined some of those on Morning Report this morning, and they include the involvement of officials who are very hands-on with this proposal at the moment in terms of how they might shape that entity, even the balance between commercial and non-commercial within one public broadcaster, and the cultures, all sorts of different things. But everyone I've talked to has said this is the start of a very long process. This is really just the beginning. So basically, Cabinet on Monday, if it does go, which I think it will, is a very high-level decision in principle. It's basically let's get on with it. So that just signs off the work that needs to be done. Then there needs to be legislation, basically setting the kind of regulatory or market groundwork to get this moving. Now, of course, as we see with all legislation, at any point during that legislation, if parties are not comfortable that it's going in the way that they want it to, they can pull their support.
Right.
Then we have a business case commissioned next year, and that's really when the nuts and bolts of how much it's going to cost, what it's going to look like, what are the implications, the really gritty stuff will come. Yeah. That is not going to be until next year.
Remembering TVNZ operates on revenue currently of $300 million and heading south, $310 million I think it is. RNZ currently publicly funded around $40 million. So
that's right.
Put together
those figures up. That's right.
Let's just quickly touch on Ports of Auckland. When we're talking about where it's at in the process, if anything comes out of Cabinet or is about to be announced out of last Monday's Cabinet meeting on this, will it be even more high level? What's going to happen a little later this morning?
So we expect the working group report that you have covered, we have covered, we know what's in that report, we know that strong recommendation to move Northport and get on with it really, really quickly. So that's all out there, but I expect that report to be publicly released today. I also understand that some work was being done, and I don't know how far along this is, to try to release some of the official advice at the same time. And of course that may be supportive, it may be challenging to the proposal. But I think the key thing is going to be what the government will do now. I would be very surprised to see a full and substantial decision about exactly what they're doing. My sense is that they're going to come out and say, this is what we need to do before we make that decision.
Next steps, and there may be a lot of them over a long time. Jane, if we do get some substantial sense of what's happening when that's released a little later in the morning, I'd love you to come back on. Thanks very much for your time. Jane Patterson is RNZ's political editor. It is nearly 10 o'clock and you are listening to 9 to noon on RNZ National.
RNZ News at 10 o'clock. Good morning, I'm Nicola Wright. The police and the government are about to give a briefing with the latest information about the eruption on Whakaari, White Island. We will cross to that news conference live as soon as it begins. In the meantime, 2 Australian brothers have been named by their school principal as the latest to be confirmed dead following the eruption. Matthew and Ben Hollander died in hospital from their injuries. They were travelling with their parents, who are still unaccounted for. The confirmed death toll now stands at 8, and another 8 people still on the island are also believed to have died. The principal of Knox Grammar, Scott James, says Matthew Hollander had a close circle of friends and was always enthusiastic about life, while Ben had a great love for the outdoors and was a compassionate, enthusiastic student. The brother of one of the New Zealand guides who died says he did not feel he would be risking his life if he was to go to the island to retrieve his body. Mark Inman asked the government for a pardon for his effort to bring home his brother, Hayden Marshall Inman. He says he has a team of experts who also believe it is safe to go to retrieve the bodies, including local pilot Mark Law. Last night, the police minister added Mr Law to the advisory team working on the body recovery. Mr Inman says that gives him more hope that a recovery might go ahead, but he believes they missed another window of opportunity yesterday afternoon to fly in. When the go-ahead is given for a recovery effort, iwi will help lead the operation. A Navy ship will go to the island and take the bodies to the coroner in Auckland. The Deputy Police Commissioner Wally Haumaha says a kaumātua from Ngāti Awa will lead the recovery team to ensure all tikanga are adhered to.
For the uplifting of the deceased, once that decision is made, Ngāti Awa will be going across to Whakaari on HMNZS Wellington, and there will be the tohunga from Ngāti Awa and a support person with him, and he will carry out the karakia, the blessings, the uplifting of the 2 pāpaku in the most appropriate way.
The Deputy Police Commissioner, Wally Haumaha. The New Zealand leader, Winston Peters, says the coalition government is agreed that RNZ and TVNZ need to be protected and future-proofed at a time when the media industry is in dire straits. D-Day is looming for a decision on a new public broadcasting super entity, with the final cabinet meeting of the year on Monday. Mr Peters has thrown his party's support behind 2 proposals for the media industry, a new public broadcaster to replace RNZ and TVNZ, and support for a renewed bid from NZME to purchase Stuff.
Both coalition partners are in agreement on the need to protect and future-proof TVNZ and Radio New Zealand. While the overarching direction has been set, the means of delivering the best outcome will still require a serious volume of work. Many questions on design and cost are still to be addressed.
Winston Peters acknowledged the NZME Stuff deal still needs to go through the Commerce Commission, which has blocked the merger before. The pilot alcohol and drug courts in Auckland and Waitakere will be made permanent as of today. The courts aim to stop reoffending by treating someone's addiction instead of sending them to jail if that is behind their crime. The Justice Minister says participants are 23% less likely to offend after completing the program. A third court operating the same way will also...
I'm Clinton O'Dear. I'm the Group Controller for the Bay of Plenty Civil Defence Emergency Management Group, and I'm leading this response to the Whakatane events, the tragic events of Monday on Whakaari, White Island. I'm joined today by Judy Turner, Mayor of Whakatane District Council, Nika Fournier, Jenny Science, who's been based here since Monday, monitoring the activity on the island, and Deputy Commissioner Mike Clemens from New Zealand Police. Firstly, I'd like to give you an overview update from the Emergency Coordination Centre. The Bay of Plenty Civil Defence Emergency Management Group has been focused on providing welfare support to victims, survivors and their families. We've established a Civil Defence Information Centre at 4 Commerce Street, adjacent to the Council facilities, where we're operating support from. We're expecting more families to start arriving in Whakatane today. We're currently focused on ensuring families of those that are injured and deceased are supported on arrival in New Zealand. So we are coordinating across New Zealand and working with various agencies. To give you an overview of the multi-agency response involved here, some of the agencies that are critical to this and involved are Civil Defence Emergency Management, the National Emergency Management Agency, New Zealand Police, the New Zealand Defence Force, GNS Science, Whakatane District Council, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the District Health Board, Customs, Immigration, iwi, Ngāti Awa, iwi, who are our local support here, Australian consulate staff, to name but a few. Specifically, the Emergency Coordination Centre is focused on providing support to New Zealand Police in the planning of their recovery operation and coordinating the welfare support to, as I said, the families. The National Emergency Management Agency has also issued an all-of-government fact sheet for public use, and the details have been provided for where people can access support and information. This is on the website of the National Emergency Management Agency. I'd just like to highlight today we're not providing an update on the health status of those in hospital. They will provide it at a later point in the course of today. I'm going to now hand over to the next speakers, and then we'll take some questions at the end. Thank you. So I invite Mayor Judy Turner.
Thank you, Mark. So I'm here today representing the very clear messaging that I'm getting from my community regarding all that is happening. I need to make it clear that while we fully appreciate the need for the safety of any recovery team going on to Whakaari White Island to retrieve our loved ones, we are now living with a growing sense of desperation to bring home those that we know are there and those we love. The frustration of those families most affected is completely understandable, and so the need for regular updates is now absolutely essential. They're asking for messages to be confirmed to them what is being planned, who will be involved, how well they will be equipped, and how responsive those teams can be once clearance is given. That is a priority for them. No news is not good news for people in this situation. I am grateful, and so are the families, to the police for including a local person with local knowledge of the island to take out onto the recovery team. This person knows exactly where the bodies are, and so will be able to help the recovery team. And this should mean that once they are on the island, their clear knowledge of where to look will save a lot of time and improve safety. I am now going to hand over to our GNS Science reporter, Nico Perini.
Good morning, everyone. First and foremost, our thoughts are with the families of all involved. I think this is a tragedy, and we are really working hard to try and assist the operations here so that we can bring closure to the families. We've been working with the responding agencies since day one, both here in Whakatane, but also in Taupo in Wellington, and we're trying to get as much real-time information to support the operations. As an update on activity at Whakaari White Islands, the situation is pretty much the same as it was yesterday night. There is still an increase in activity and increase in pressure inside the volcano. We believe that there is shallow magma, the molten rocks, which is driving the activity at under the surface, and this is portrayed by one of our main indicators, which is the level of tremor that is increasing, and it's keep increasing as we speak as well. The consequence of those processes is that the situation remains highly volatile, and all our combined data are actually suggesting that to that extent. This is the most active that Whakaari White Island has been since 2016, and probably going back to quite a few years as well. So it is really a high level of unrest at this volcano. What we're doing at the moment, all our monitoring equipment that we rely on is still operating on island, so we are able to get 24/7 monitoring of the activity, both by our scientists and by the National Geohazards Monitoring Centre based in Wellington. We're doing also some flights around the volcano at a reasonable distance to try to get an idea about the amount of gas emitted by this volcano. This is not for health impact on the ground. This is just as an indicator of this magma coming up from the volcano, so very much along the same line that the tremor. What we're doing to try to assist the operations is to provide an idea about the likelihood of an eruption over the next 24 hours. And I just got the latest numbers, and they are still the same as yesterday's. So to our knowledge at the moment, our best estimate is that the likelihood of an eruption over the next 24 hours that would affect the area potentially where the rescue team would be is still between 40 and 60%. So this is a highly risked operation. Because the volcano is not currently erupting, the alert level is raised down to 2, but this is just portraying that it's currently not erupting. It doesn't mean that it can't erupt, and the eruption probability is still very high. So again, the focus right now is on providing in real-time support to the rescue operations, providing the likelihood of an eruption and the risk that would those teams take on the ground, and to assist the rescue and bring closure to the families. And finally, I'd just like to reiterate that we'd like to bring basically all our thoughts are with the family of those injured and affected by the eruptions. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou. I'm Mike Clement. For people who don't know me, I'm the Deputy Commissioner of National Operations based in Police National Headquarters, but the local controller from a police perspective as of yesterday. I just too want to acknowledge grieving families in New Zealand and abroad, and in particular a grieving community locally here in Whakatane, Eastern Bay of Plenty, more broadly across New Zealand. I can tell you that there is no greater priority in New Zealand Police, and I think I confidently speak for all of the agencies who stand alongside us, Foreign Emergency, health officials, Defence Force and Mines Rescue. So we are all equally committed to finding a solution that safely gets us onto the island so that we can recover the people we believe to be deceased on that island and return those people after a DVI process to their whānau. So that is the highest priority for us. I can assure you that everybody is equally committed to that function. So what are we doing currently? You've just heard the context with regard to the risk on the island. No one can ignore that, particularly us who've got responsibilities for all of our people to do that as safely as we can in context with the function that we've been asked to perform. So we have that in the forefront of our thinking. So we have a group of people who are committed, locked away in a room just downtown here, who are working, and that's the group of agencies that I just referenced a few moments ago. A group of agencies who are working away at developing options for me, given that risk profile that Nico has just outlined to you. That could change tomorrow, and so the options would include, if the situation on the island changed in terms of that interpretation as to risk, then our options would change with it. So as we are proceeding on the basis that, number one, the risk is about the likelihood of another eruption, and Nico has outlined that, and the second dimension to the risk profile that we have to take into consideration is the presence of gases on the island, and that can have a lot to do with the environmental factors, including wind. Is the wind taking the gas away from the area in which we'd have to be working to recover those bodies? So without further ado, I was just going to take any questions from you. I just want to acknowledge the fact that a group of pilots and people who operators from White Island Tours who went onto the island to recover those that were living in the immediate aftermath of the eruption have rightly deserved praise from New Zealanders and those abroad. And I met with some of those, not all of those operators, but some of those operators last night, and I listened to their stories, and I'm sure that the media is listening to some of those stories too. And they put themselves well out in the front of their own thoughts with regard to their own safety in the interests of saving those that were alive on the island. They too went through a risk assessment. They might have not done it in a formalised way as we must, but they too went through a risk assessment in their own minds with regard to how long they could stay in that environment. And I believe that they made the right decision with regard to coming off the island and taking stock with regard to next steps. So I'm full of admiration for what they did. It happens often here and elsewhere, and I think they're heroes. Your questions are going to be, will we recognise them as heroes? I'm very confident we'll do that in the fullness of time. In the meantime, we're working with that group of people, and we've asked for two of those people to work very closely with us as we develop the plan with regard to going on to White Island to recover the bodies.
Why was the knowledge and advice ignored up until now?
Pardon me, sorry?
Why have police been ignoring their advice and local knowledge until now?
Well, I don't think I'd call it ignoring the advice, but when I got here last night, it's clearly that they've got a story to tell. So the people that we're talking about that I said was representing those organisations, Fire and Emergency, Mines Rescue, Police and Defence, probably amongst them there is not a person who's been on White Island. I imagine, I don't know for sure, there might be, just by chance. The reality is what we did this last night was listen to them, because they've got incredible experience, some of them decades, with regard to going on to White Island, and so we need to make sure that we factor that in terms of the plan that we develop with regard to going back on there. It may or may not involve them directly, but it certainly will involve taking their thoughts with regard to their experience of the island.
Mike, can you get them off today? Can you get those bodies off today?
Well, you just heard about the reality is we can do anything, but as the officer in charge here locally in Whakatane, am I going to do that, given the risk that you've just had detailed to you? Not without a clear plan that's agreed by all of those agencies who have responsibility for their people to do it safely or in a way that's in context with the tasks that we've been given. That is to recover people we believe to be deceased. So could we go on and do it today? Yes, we could, but you've just heard Nico outline the risk that exists on the island. So at no time in the last 2 years, probably longer, has the risk of further eruption been greater. So I think you can all stand here and appreciate the sorts of things that as an organisation or as a lead with regard to the recovery that I've got to consider in that regard. So the answer is, could I? Yes, I could, but the real question is, can I do that in context with the risk and with my obligation to keep our people safe?
Is that no at the moment?
Well, if you're asking me for an answer right this second, I would say no, because I don't have a plan that satisfies me that the risk is able to be mitigated to the extent that I need it to be mitigated to keep those people safe, given that profile that Nico has outlined to you. So I think everybody can appreciate, right? We've got a level of activity on the island with regard to the potential for further eruption that is unprecedented in the last couple of years, potentially longer, and I simply can't ignore that, and I'm pretty confident everybody listening and you folk will understand the reason for that. Can I indicate who's coming next? Otherwise we'll...
Would any plan mitigate the current risk if the risk remains where it is?
I don't think, we don't approach this on the basis of mitigating down to zero, so I'm not being ridiculous about it.
So what are you comfortable with?
So at the end of the day, what I have to do is plan for a range of options. At the moment, the risk of an eruption, you've heard Nico say to you, is in the range of 40 to 60%. At the moment, unless we can mitigate, and that's what the options development is attempting to achieve, down to a level where I think that I've got a degree of comfort as the person making the call with regard to what we do next, then we can't make that call. So,
Mr. Clement, you'll appreciate Mayor Turner was saying that there is a need for the families to be informed, to understand what's going on. There is a growing frustration about what happens next, who's doing what. Can you assure the families that there is going to be a time frame, at least, of when those bodies can be recovered? Because as time passes by, the status of those bodies, the conditions of those bodies is also concerning families as well. And we heard one of the brothers speak earlier.
Yeah, so I understand all of the factors with regard to what we're playing up against here. So, number one, I can't give an assurance around a timeline because the reality is I don't control all of the factors yet. So you've had the risk outlined to you. I don't control what the volcano is doing in terms of eruption. So until I can get a really clear sense of what the risk is with regard to the likelihood of eruption in context with the plans that we are developing, then I can't make a commitment to these families. This is core to policing, is making sure that the people who are nearest and dearest to those that are impacted, particularly those that are left on the island, is in the forefront of our thinking. It's what drives all of us. There won't be a person in the room that has got more passion about going onto that island than police staff. We are all deeply passionate about getting onto the island to recover those bodies. I give that commitment to this community, to those whānau, whether they are in New Zealand or abroad. I know everybody is watching. I have conversations with colleagues in other jurisdictions about the approach that they might take. And we are all burdened with the very same challenge when it comes to the decisions that we have to make. I understand completely. I will make myself available to all of you folk, to family, to answer their questions. We're pushing hard with regard to what we call family liaison officers, flows, by another definition. So each of those whānau has family liaison officers associated with them. But bear in mind, and we see this play out time and time again, we've got a real challenge with regard to that, because some of the next of kin are right here in New Zealand and alongside us with regard to that, and some of them are abroad, right? So they're not all here. Some of them are travelling to New Zealand. So there's quite a challenge in terms of being able to meet the expectation of the people who are here in New Zealand, here in this community, and who are abroad and who are very closely related to those who are impacted. Sorry.
You said you've asked for some options. Can you give us a flavour of what those might be?
Well, I will be able to after midday, but I've got a sense of them. So I think, that the options are all the way from, if we had to act now, how do I get a sense as the person making the call with regard to that I can mitigate the risk to the satisfaction of those agencies? Because while I can speak for police personnel, each of the chief executives of the agencies that are involved, whether it's FENZ or New Zealand Defence Force or Mines Rescue or police, have each got the same obligation, and potentially they will make up the teams that go onto the island. So it may not be all police. Police doesn't necessarily possess all of the skills against some of the options that might be developed. So the options will be in the range of get in quick, uplift the bodies and get out as quickly as you can. Now that makes sense to everybody, right? But there's a consequence or a trade-off for that, because one of the disciplines associated with uplifting deceased people in a mass casualty situation like this is preserving the evidence that might lead to identity. And the more time we can spend with the body when we uplift it from the circumstances in which they've died, the more likelihood that we can preserve that evidence. So there's a trade-off if we get in and do that fast and bring them out versus planning for a scenario where we're going to be able to spend more time at the scene with those bodies preserving that evidence, so as that we're able to take identification evidence to the coroner who signs off in terms of identity, because we'll get no thanks whatsoever if we reach a situation at the end of this where we're not able to sign off on identity. That would be an absolute poor outcome for us. We aim to repatriate all of the deceased to their families and do so in a way that there is conclusive proof to the satisfaction of the coroner with regard to identity. So they're all trade-off situations. That's my job, is to consider the options given that scenario, those scenarios.
I know you don't want to engage in criticism of the families, but it strikes me that the criticism may well be a bit unfair towards the police, given the fact that people are suggesting that the alert level had gone from 1 to 2. So why were the tourists allowed on the island? Now you have an even more heightened risk. Yes. The expectation is that you go straight onto the island.
Yeah, well, that's the reality of it. I mean, people do things in the moment, and they did that act of bravery no one's going to try and unpick. So they went through the very same risk assessment, but not in the way in which I'm doing it. And currently, I've got an obligation. I've got to do it in a certain way. I mean, otherwise, number one, I'm putting my people and the people in other agencies at risk. But that doesn't say that people who don't go through that same process aren't going to intervene. So if you put it into a scenario where someone sees something violent happening on the street, say an assault, and they intervene in that, I'm sure they don't go through a long and detailed risk assessment. They probably just pile into it and think, I need to stop this because I don't like seeing what I'm seeing. But the reality is, in the fullness of time, so once having made a decision that the people who were alive were able to be saved, were saved, and those that weren't able to be saved are still on the island, they reached that conclusion themselves. So I understand why people will say, back to your question, well, why don't you just take the same approach they took? I mean, they managed to get onto the island and recover those bodies and they didn't come to any harm. The reality is that happened in the moment. I don't have that moment. I can't go back and reinvent that moment. None of us can.
Mr. Clement, are you worried that if there were to be another eruption on the island, given that the bodies have been there for days now, that A, you won't be able to get on the island for a while, and B, that you won't be able to identify them and recover them?
Absolutely. That's all in the mix with regard to, so what are we trying to achieve here? Because to Paul's question, in the first instance, I race onto the island and collect them now and take the risk that you do, versus all the way through to, the scenario that might be that you mitigate this thing down to zero. It's 3 weeks later. So much activity has happened potentially with regard to what happens to the volcano, but also decomposition, that you end up not having anything that's of value, certainly from an identification perspective, but in terms of being able to return that person.
Nico, in terms of, you're talking about the generic conditions right now. What conditions would somebody on a volcano be exposed to in that immediate moment? We're talking about rescuers going there to retrieve the body. Should there be another phreatic explosion, for example? What sort of heat what sort of conditions in terms of sulfuric acid? Can you describe just how dangerous it would be in that mine?
Sure. So if we had an eruption again tomorrow or today, or while people were on island, you would be exposed to a range of hazards, and this is what killed, unfortunately, the people a few earlier in the week. Kind of hazards that you would be affected by would be basically very fast ballistics. So we're talking blocks, rocks, going at incredibly high speeds, and that would be one source of casualty. Basically, you would be pummeled to death effectively. The ash would probably be quite high. It depends on how much magma is actually involved in the eruptions, so it could go from a few hundred degrees Celsius to higher temperatures. So we're talking about very high speed, high impact, high temperature impact on people. I think it's important to stress that right now what is preventing the rescue operations on island is really the risk of the eruption. This is really what is really putting people at risk to life safety. There are some hazards associated with environmental hazards, and those are being worked on to actually mitigate.
Some of the world's most famous and deadly volcanic eruptions have had phreatic explosions precede them. Is there any indication that there could be an outflow of magma, or is it even a possibility, like basically that would dwarf what happened a few days ago?
So what we had a bit earlier this week was possibly a phreatic eruption. We're still trying to work out what happened exactly, but all the evidence we're having from our monitoring data is pointing out magma being present at shallow level. So what this means, it means that the next eruption could actually involve magma being hotter, possibly be more powerful as well.
You have obviously historic data because you've been monitoring this volcano for a great deal of time. Have you done any modelling as to when it could be possible to go back onto the volcano?
Yeah, so we're doing a lot of quantitative estimates of probabilities. So we're not just popping that number out of back pocket. So we're going through a very rigorous process, and it's about asking teams of experts to give the best estimate based on the current situation and the data that we're recording in real time.
What is the modelling data saying?
So what the modelling is, the output of that modelling, it's basically the numbers we have been producing, which is the probability of an eruption over the next 24 hours affecting the area where the people would be walking. So effectively the 40 to 60% numbers are coming from quite a rigorous process that has been peer-reviewed by international experts as well.
Any data on like 5 to 7 days or something like that, if we're looking further out as to a time when you will be able to get on the road?
So we can't really do predictions there. What we can do is really try. We could give a wider, and we do give wider time windows, but really it's not really helping that much. It's not providing more accuracy later down the line. Right now we're focusing on the time window that is relevant and useful for the rescue operations. Right now it's 24 hours because the volatility of the system is quite high. So going much beyond that probably would be very uncertain.
What conditions would people have to hit on the island to rescue or to repatriate people, and how close would they be to the crater? Like in terms of if you want to get assets on the ground quickly and get this done, like how many different places would they all need to be, and how close would they be to the centre of activity?
So I can talk very briefly and perhaps asking others to comment there. In a nutshell, I think the working operations would probably be 300 meters plus from the active vent, which is very close from the active vent.
300 meters from, and how many like different positions around?
I'll probably ask the police commissioner to respond to that.
So it's in an area of about 200 square metres, so about up to, I suppose, a maximum of 300 metres from the shoreline. And they're, imagine they're in sort of clusters, small groups. So they are all reasonably accessible to each other. They're not over a vast area.
When you say shoreline or the crater?
No, so I'm between the shoreline and the crater.
So it's about a 15-minute walk from the shoreline to where the bodies are.
And they're all in the same area?
Well, broadly speaking, within an area of about 200 square metres.
Like the official toll is at 8, and there's also 8 people believed to be on the island. There's also a missing list of 9 people.
That's right, yes.
Will there be an effort today to consolidate, provide more sort of accurate, precise information around?
Yeah, so I think most of you appreciate the problem we've got with regard to identifying. So we don't identify people. That's the role of the coroner, and I'd have a very grumpy coroner if I said to you that we've made identifications outside of that process. What experience tells us is that people want to know, and people already do. So there's people out in the community who can do their own reconciliation, because there's 47 people went onto the island. There's a group of people who are in hospital, and so they work out, of course, just like you will, that there's a group of people, some of whom we've got the identities for, who are missing, presumed to be dead. So that's why we've put up the list. So there's 16 in that category. 8 people who have deceased who are either brought back to the island, arrived back on the island. Some of them were already deceased, and since 3 more have died in hospital. Right, so that makes a total of 8. And we believe there to be, but we need to confirm this by going onto the island and collecting the bodies, but having debriefed the people who were on the island who took them there and who went to the island immediately afterwards, we believe there's 8. But that is subject to final confirmation. So the group, so I just need to answer the question because I think there's a bit of confusion about the 9. So how do you get 16, 8 and 8 equals 16, so how do you get to 9? So the 8 we can say that are missing with a reasonable amount of confidence because we can't reconcile those 8 names with the people who are in hospital who have been discharged, right? The 9th is the person that we don't have enough detail to be working with a next of kin to say that we are confident that we've got an identity subject to confirmation by the coroner. So that's why there are 9 people in the mix. 8 on the island and one of those who's since died in the hospital, making a total of 9 out of the 16 total. Does that make sense?
2 more questions.
How quickly are this updated? Because we understand Grant Dello's family say that he has been found, but on the police list it says he's still missing.
Right. So the problem we've got is where there's a process underway with the coroner, so the 9, there is no process underway. So the terminology is important here, is missing. Police, it's not the role of police to name them as deceased. What we're saying is they are missing. Where there's a process underway that's now in the hands of the coroner to work through a DVI process to name them after the coroner is confident, having gone through a post-mortem and identification process to name them, we're not at liberty to do that. So what we've tried to do is reach an accommodation to say is, of the people that are not in that process yet, that we will name them as missing. That's the 9 who are named as missing. As the process works through with regard to the other 7, is my maths right? Someone tell me. So we've got 8 who have died having reached the mainland. So as that process continues and the coroner signs off on those identification processes, then those names will be released as confirmed identities. In the meantime, we've got a problem naming those that are already in the mix. We are working with the next of kin, so whoever raised the point with regard to that, that is right. So the next of kin will know that we are confident that we are working with their next of kin who is deceased, but the decision about putting the name up on the website is not ours. It's got to go through a coronial process.
Can I ask 2 minutes? You've heard our priorities to get out there and plan. We'd just like to get back to there, so if I can ask 2 minutes.
Are you worried that there's a scenario where you will not be able to recover those bodies?
Of course I'm worried. I'd be, like everybody else, worried that we don't get out there to recover those bodies. And it's my job to make sure that I push the planning team to ensure that doesn't happen. But I don't control everything at play here, okay? So, I mean, to the questions that were asked before, if the science, as it's predicting, that an eruption has got a 40 to 60% chance of reoccurring, and that happens, and before I've been able to commit and mitigate that risk to a satisfactory standard to be able to get people on the island to recover those bodies, then of course that worries me. That would be a scenario that I wouldn't want to contemplate, and I'm sure that would go for everybody.
Mr. Chairman, is there a level of risk that you are comfortable with as far as the likelihood of another eruption to get out onto this island?
Well, that's what I have to be convinced by my team, who's going to be talking to me with those options and the 2 local operators at midday today. So at midday they will come back to me and say, here's the risk in terms of what's happening on the island, we're on the mountain, and the environmental factors. Here's our options development, and I've got to go through a process of saying the very thing that you've just asked. That's the job that I've got to do.
Is there any circumstance in which you would circumvent what the rules are, in inverted commas, in terms of the coronial process? Identification is one thing, but obviously cause of death is something that is so obvious it doesn't need further examination to mitigate the risk of having to stay on the island for so long. I mean, can you just get in and get out and forego the burden of evidence?
Yeah, well, we wouldn't be foregoing it. We would just be taking away some of the indicators that lead to identity. So, I mean, personally, I think that's a trade-off for the option that will be presented to me, I'm confident, at midday, is to say, well, okay, if one of the options you want, boss, is to get in and get those people off the island quickly, then I'm telling you now you run a risk that we lose some of the identification opportunities. I'll buy that probably. I think, in the interest that we're all thinking here is, wouldn't it be better to have the body in a state that's acceptable and forego? Now, that's easy for me to say, and you'll all nod, but if you're the next of kin and we don't get an identification as a consequence of taking that process, they are not going to be happy, and I would understand that, and so would you.
Would you seek a consensus from the next of kin that they're happy with that outcome?
That's a possibility that we would do that. We would go to them and say, this could be a consequence. And I need to know how sure that is. I mean, there's not just one factor that we consider when it comes to identification. There's fingerprints, there's DNA, there's visuals, although visuals less reliable, particularly in these circumstances. There's a range of factors. So I don't think we're going to die in a ditch over a process that's globally practiced and consistent, because the reality is we have to play that up against the circumstances, and no one controls the circumstances. So, I get the sense in the room, and it sits with me also, is that get those people off and then deal with the trade-off that comes as a consequence of that later. I think that's a real possibility, but we haven't reached that point yet. Okay.
We heard earlier that the predictions can't always be accurate and that you can't give longer-term predictions. How can you give assurances that it was safe to go on if predictions are so close to the wire? You said that in the next 24 hours, obviously your own updates changed during this, covering this incident. If you can't give long-term updates, how often do you update tour companies like White Island Tours that go to volcanoes?
Have you looked forward to it?
So I think there is a little bit to unpack here. So at the moment, we provide those updates to the rescue operations, and really the aim is to provide as much, as precise information as we can give, as accurate information as we can, to all of those guys to make the right decision for their staff.
But what I'm asking is, what data were the companies working on to know that it was safe to take people out to that island, if you can't predict that far ahead?
So this is not a conversation, I think, to have with me. I think what we provide is information through the alert level and through this kind of updates, and we've been providing those over the past few weeks, effectively. Then the decision of bringing people on island is not mine, and not mine to comment, to be fair.
At what point would DNS be sending scientists to a volcano if it had the threat level of eruption of up to 50%? Is there a number that you would not be sending people?
Yeah, there are numbers. There are numbers there. I probably won't get into the details there. They are basically much lower than what we've got right now, effectively. So the level of risk right now is far too high for sending one of our staff out there. The level of risk is one part of the conversation. The acceptability of risk is another one. And of course, this changes. You wouldn't jump in a car which is engulfed in flame if nothing, you've got nothing in there. If it's your child, you will. So that acceptability of risk is the important conversations, and it's not the same for a scientist, for response agencies, and everybody is well aware of that.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your time. We will be back with more briefings for you. If you could just excuse us, we'd really like to get back. We've got a 12 o'clock deadline to get back.
Take 2 minutes. I'm Sharon here from the BBC. We'd just like to get a little bit of what community
See that you're helping something bigger than yourself, it just makes life easier. It makes waking up in the morning a bit easier. So I don't know if I do it selfishly to wake up in the morning or if I just feel like that's what I'm here for. But I've always wanted to try and serve a purpose. I think we all do. That's why when people retire, they get depressed, we need something to wake up for.
There's an important juncture an artist reaches, probably more than one. I mean, things can go one way, they can go another way. And you've had your ups and downs. We talked about the way one of those original bands broke up right when it had just achieved something amazing, and we're going to finish listening to some of that music in a moment and talk about next year's festival. But there's moments where either you get into something that's sustainable or you don't.
Yeah.
There's been, I suspect, this move home and where you're heading